The smell of wet peat and weak lamp oil hung over the boardwalk when Bohdana heard the warning, and by then the fog had already swallowed the far bank. She was standing over a splintered bench in the front room, pressing her thumb against a swollen wrist, while a farmer's boy bit down on a strip of cloth so he would not cry out. The stove gave off a tired heat, the kind that barely touched your knees, and outside, somewhere in the reeds, a heron let out one rough, lonely call. Bohdana did not rush. She never rushed. In the fen, haste got you a twisted ankle, a broken rib, or worse. That was why the 5 half-drowned hamlets trusted her more than they trusted any town doctor. She set bones straight with a feel for the joint, fed fevered children bitter broth that made them sweat through the night, and knew which mud banks could hold a cart and which would give way under the first bad step. People came to her when the ache in the weather settled into their lungs, when a cow calved sideways, when a baby would not stop crying. They came because she knew the marsh like a body. She knew where it hurt, and she knew what men were like when money made them brave. When the banks failed and the village savings turned to paper and apologies, the peasants brought their votive silver to the little shrine she kept above the bog. Coins wrapped in oilcloth, a wedding ring, a saint's plaque with the paint worn soft by fingers. Bohdana took each bundle with both hands, said the same prayer every time, and locked it away under the lifted boards of the shrine, where dry moss kept the metal from tarnish and the water could not reach. No one called it rich. They called it safe. Then, just before dusk, a stranger came splashing along the outer path, his boots black with fen water and his face pinched from cold. He did not even sit down before he spoke. Said the riverboat men had been asking questions, said they knew there was silver on the marsh, said they were coming back with an answer of their own if she did not hand it over. Bohdana only wiped her hands on her apron and looked out through the smoked glass at the white fog rolling low over the reeds. "The bog keeps what it is owed," she said, so quietly he almost missed it. The boy on the bench stared at her, and even the stove seemed to go still. By nightfall, the first lanterns had appeared on the water, one, then another, moving slow between the black reed shadows, as if the fog itself had learned to float. Bohdana stepped onto the porch, lifted her chin, and listened to the hollow slap of oars coming nearer. Something in the marsh answered with a soft, wet gurgle from far below the planks, and that was when she understood the toll men had finally arrived. If you want the next part, like this story and subscribe so you don't miss what the fen does next. By the time the first boat scraped into the reeds, Bohdana had already banked the stove and turned the shrine key twice. The room was tight with kettle steam, old candle wax, and the sour smell of wet wool drying too slowly by the wall. Outside, the fog lay so thick over the water that the lanterns looked like tired eyes drifting on their own. If you've ever stood close to a river at night, you know that sound. Not the water itself, the little noises around it. Oars dipping, rope running over wood, a board groaning under a wet boot. In a place like this, every one of those sounds means somebody is coming with a purpose. She stepped to the window and saw the men on the lower landing. 4 of them this time. One stayed in the boat, hands on the gunwale, while the others came forward in a line that was trying very hard to look calm. Their coats were dark with river spray. Their boots left shining prints on the boards. The one in front carried himself like a man used to being answered. He had a neat beard, a polished belt buckle, and the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He called up to her as if they were old neighbors. "Lady Bohdana, we'd rather settle this without trouble." That word hung in the fog like a stain. She did not answer right away. Instead, she lifted the latch on the inner shelf and checked the small bundles wrapped in cloth, the rings and coins, and the little saint's plaque that the villagers had brought when the banks failed. The silver was still there, cool and safe under the shrine boards, and she could hear, faintly, the scared breathing of the boy she had told to hide in the back room. The ringman looked up at the shrine and smiled a little wider. "You know what we came for." "I know what you think you came for," she said. His men laughed under their breath, but it sounded thin. The fog had a way of eating confidence before it reached the ground. Bohdana went down the porch steps slowly, Not because she was afraid of him, but because she had spent her whole life learning how a board flexed in damp weather. The landing was slick with river slime. A black reed hissed against the piling. Somewhere out in the fen, a frog gave one startled croak and then fell silent. The man in front took off one glove, as if he wanted her to see the hand with which he expected to be obeyed. "The people on the riverboat say the silver belongs to trade now. You kept it long enough." She looked past him, past the boat, out toward the water where the mist moved like breath across a mouth. Then she said, very softly, "The bog keeps what it is owed." That made one of the men shift his feet. Behind Bohdana, the shrine bell rope gave a tiny, dry creak in the still air. She heard it, and she heard something else, too. A slow slap under the lower boards, where the water was touching the fin from below. She turned her head just a little, following the sound, and saw the ringman looking toward the shrine door, as if he had finally noticed how close the dark had come. Then he took one step onto the landing, and the boards answered him with a long, unhappy groan. The man in front lifted one boot, then set it down again, testing the porch as if he expected the fin itself to answer him. Bohdana watched that small movement and knew he was the kind who measured every plank before he trusted a room. His breath came out in little white bursts. Behind him, the boat rocked softly against the reeds, and the water under the landing made that slow, sucking sound that only Marsh people really notice. He smiled at her like a man offering a favor. "No need for this to get ugly, Bohdana. We know the shrine has silver." She stayed where she was, one hand on the porch rail, the wood damp and cold under her fingers. The front room smelled of thyme, ash, and the wet hide of the boy's boots by the stove. In the back, the curtain barely moved. He was still hiding there, quiet as a mouse, exactly where she had told him to stay. "The shrine holds prayers," she said, "and bandages, and the names of the dead." One of the men in the landing gave a short laugh, but it sounded thin in the fog. The leader's eyes flicked toward the shrine door, then back to her face. He had seen old women before, plenty of them. He had not seen one who looked at his hands the way she did, like she could already tell which knuckles would split first in winter. "Don't play holy with us," he said. "People gave you rings, coins, a plaque. You kept it. Now it moves." Bohdana stepped aside and let the door stand open just enough for the smell of beeswax and old cloth to drift out. Not an invitation, a warning. The silver sat under the shrine boards, wrapped and calm, while the fog pressed close around the eaves. Somewhere farther out, a rope creaked on the boat, and a gull cried once over the black water. "You came by river," she said, "so you know how this place answers. You know the channels, the soft edges, the places that look firm until a heel goes through. A man who works the fen ought to respect it." He looked past her, toward the back room, and Bohdana saw the exact moment he realized the boy was there. Just a flicker. Enough. The ringleader didn't scare easy, but he understood leverage, and that made him worse. "We'll settle it neat," he said. "Silver on the porch by tomorrow night. No tricks, no prayers. If you make us come back for it, we'll bring people who don't mind mud." Bohdana's mouth stayed still, but her eyes went to the black water under the landing. The tide was already turning. Not enough to matter to him now, maybe. Enough to matter later. Enough to matter when the rotten spring ice came and the whole fen started changing shape under a man's feet. The leader gave the porch one last look, then the shrine door. He was smiling again, but now the smile had a crack in it. "Open the boards," he said, quiet as a knife, "and let's see what you're guarding so hard." Bohdana. Bohdana let the silence sit between them for a moment longer. The man had asked to see what she was guarding, and in the fen, that kind of request was never simple. It was a hand reaching toward a knife laid on the table. She turned away from the landing and pushed the shrine door wider instead of shutting it. A draft came through the boards, carrying the smell of cold water and old reeds. Inside, the little room was dim and dry, and the oil lamp made the silver under the cloth glow in soft, muted lumps. The boy behind the curtain held still. Bohdana heard him breathing, quick and shallow, trying not to make a sound. "You may stand there if you want," she said to the leader, "but you'll keep your boots off my threshold." That got a twitch of amusement from one of his men. The leader did not laugh. He was staring at the floor, at the narrow gap between the porch boards, where a thin thread of black water could be seen moving below. He had not expected the ground to feel so alive. "You're stalling," he said. "I'm deciding," Bohdana answered. She went to the stove, lifted the lid of the kettle, and let the steam rise into the room, just enough to cloud the corners. The men on the landing shifted again. Their shoulders were wet, their collars stiff with river spray, and the cold had already started to work into them. Bohdana knew that look. Men like this always thought fear came from a gun. More often, it came from being unable to trust the place under your feet. The youngest one leaned in first, peering past her shoulder. He had the kind of face that still wanted to believe there was a clean answer waiting somewhere. Bohdana saw his eyes catch on the cloth bundles, the little saint plaque, the thin edge of a silver ring. He swallowed once. The leader noticed that glance and hardened at once. "Take the cloth off," he said. "No." "Then we take it." Bohdana rested her hand on the kettle handle. The iron was hot enough to sting through her palm, but she did not move away. Out beyond the porch, a reed stem scraped against the piling, making a sound like dry fingers over bone. Somewhere under the landing, the water gave one slow, hollow thump against the supports. "The bog keeps what it is owed," she said again, and this time the words seemed to settle lower in the room, like silt. The leader's face lost a little of its smoothness. Not much, just enough. He took one step toward the door, then stopped when the porch gave a small, tired groan beneath his weight. For the first time, he looked down at the boards as if he did not quite like what he saw there. And from the back room, through the curtain, Bohdana heard the boy whisper one frightened word, because something outside had just brushed the shrine wall, slow and wet, as if somebody were feeling their way along the dark. On a fog-bound river fin, Bohdana, an old Marsh healer who set bones and brewed fever cures for 5 flooded hamlets, is given an ultimatum by a riverboat extortion ring, demanding the votive silver the peasants entrusted to her shrine. She warns them the bog keeps what it is owed, and at the spring thaw, she lets the rotten ice and sinkholes swallow them, then melts the silver into a new bell for the drowned chapel. After the leader backed off the porch, Bohdana did not move right away. She listened until the boat slid away from the landing and the reeds settled back into their wet whisper. Only then did she cross the shrine room, pull the curtain aside, and look at the boy crouched behind the stove. "Stay quiet," she told him, "and if you hear boots again, you do not open anything." His face was pale in the lamplight, one cheek smeared with soot from the stovepipe. He nodded hard enough to make his hair fall into his eyes. Bohdana reached past him, took the cloth bundles from the shelf one by one, and checked the ties with fingers that still knew every knot. The silver was there, the saint plaque, the ring with the bent stone setting, cold metal, warm trust. That was all. Outside, the fog had thickened. The landing boards were slick with river slime, and the porch rail felt wet as skin. Bohdana stepped down, careful with each board, and walked to the edge where the reeds gave way to open black water. The river smell was stronger now, muddy and sweet, and a little rotten under it all. Somewhere out in the fen, a hidden channel gulped once, like a throat clearing. She bent and touched the mud at the edge with 2 fingers. Soft already. Too soft for this hour. That was the trouble with the thaw. It did not arrive in one piece. It came in little betrayals. A skin of ice that looked sound in the gray morning. A bank that held until a boot pressed it. A path that kept its shape just long enough to fool a man from the river. Bohdana straightened and looked toward the hamlet lights beyond the reeds. A few shutters were still open. Somebody was watching her from behind one of them, waiting to see whether she would fold now that the boatmen had shown their teeth. She knew that feeling too. In the fen, fear traveled faster than news. So she went to the first house, then the second, moving boardwalk to boardwalk with a basket on her arm and a face that gave nothing away. One woman had a child with a hot forehead. Another had a husband coughing wet and deep from the chest. Bohdana laid hands where they hurt, gave out the bitter fever root she kept tied in a pouch, and said little. But by the time she reached the last house, the word had already gone around. The toll men had come. They wanted the shrine silver. They had left empty-handed. That should have eased the people. It did not. Old Masha, with her scarf tied over 3 layers of wool, caught Bohdana by the sleeve and whispered, "They'll come back on rotten spring ice, won't they?" Bohdana looked past her shoulder, over the black water and the reed tops, and did not answer right away. Instead, she said, "Lock your lower doors tonight, and keep the children off the east path at dawn." Masha's eyes widened a little. She understood enough to go pale. When Bohdana returned to the shrine, the curtain was still moving, though there was no wind in the room. The boy was asleep now, curled on the bench with one fist under his chin. Bohdana crossed to the shelf, set the silver bundles back down, and froze. One of the cloth ties had been loosened, just loosened. And on the floor beneath the shelf, half hidden in the dust, lay a strip of wet cord that had not been there before. Bohdana. By the time the kettle settled again, Bohdana had already bent over the strip of cord and pinched it between 2 fingers. It was wet, dark, and rough with river grit. Not shrine twine, not anything from her shelves. It smelled faintly of tar and fish oil, the kind that clung to ropes on working boats. She did not look at the boy right away. First she held the cord close to the lamp and studied the cut end. Clean, not frayed. Someone had brought it in on purpose, slipped it under the shelf, and left it where a tired eye would miss it. That was the ugly part, not theft. A message. The boy stood up from behind the stove, half awake now, rubbing sleep from his face. "What is it?" "Nothing for you to touch," she said. He obeyed at once, which told her he had been frightened enough to listen. Bohdana crossed to the shrine boards and knelt, letting the wood answer under her weight. The floor was cool through her skirt. She pressed her ear close, listening. Water moved underneath with a low, dull hush. The boards were dry enough on top, but beneath them, the fen was breathing. That was when she saw it. One board near the shelf had been lifted and set back so neatly the gap was almost invisible. Not forced, prized and returned. Someone had gone under there with care, lifted the cloth bundle just enough to count it, then closed it again like a guest leaving a borrowed room. Bohdana rose without a word and checked the latch on the back window. Shut. Then the shutter over the little side hole. Shut. The door bar still held. No broken glass, no boot marks in the mud outside. Whoever had come came in like smoke, or through someone else's hands. She went back to the shelf, lifted the silver bundles one by one, and tucked the heaviest of them deeper into the hollow under the stove stone. The boy watched her every move. She did not explain. Men who wanted silver did not usually stop at taking silver, and a shrine that had already been tested once would be tested again. Outside, the fog had shifted thinner over the reeds, and a pale ribbon of water showed where the path to the hamlet crossed the lower bank. Bohdana stepped onto the porch and looked down that line. One set of fresh prints marked the wet mud there, narrow and deliberate, then stopped at the very edge of the boards, as if the maker had stood still a long time before turning away. No boat rocked in the distance now. No voices, just the fin noises, slow and patient, and that thin sucking sound under the landing. She crouched, touched the print with the tip of her finger, and lifted her hand to her nose. Tar again. Then, just beyond the reeds, something gave a soft knock against wood. Once, and then again, like a pole being set down very carefully. The second knock came from under the porch. Bohdana stopped in the doorway and held her breath, listening to the little sound of water shifting below the boards. Not a hand on wood, not a boot on a step. Something lower, something patient. She took the lamp, told the boy to stay by the stove, and walked out into the fog with the flame cupped close to her chest. The landing was empty, but the mud around it was not. Fresh pole marks cut across the soft edge of the bank, and the wet prints stopped where the ground turned too thin to trust. The smell there changed too. Tar, river slime, and that sharp, oily bite that clung to boat rope. Bohdana crouched, touched one print, and saw that the heel had dragged a little, as if the man who made it had been turning in a hurry. That was enough for her. She followed the marks down the side path, past the reeds where the water rose black and still, and found a strip of cord looped around a cattail stalk. A boatman's hitch, tight, neat, deliberate. It had been used to lift the loose board under the shrine shelf, then pulled free again so no one would notice the gap unless they knew where to look. That meant they had not come here to grab and run. They had come to map the place, to learn where the weight sat, where the boards gave, where the bank whispered before it broke. At the edge of the reeds, half hidden by fog, a low skiff drifted in a pocket of still water with no lantern showing. Bohdana saw only its dark side and the wet shine of oars laid flat inside it. It had been there all along, close enough to reach the shrine without leaving proper tracks, close enough to come back before dawn. She turned and went to the nearest hamlet first, because fear spreads faster than fever in a place like this. Old Masha was the one who opened her door, and Bohdana did not waste words. Keep the children indoors. Lock the lower boards. No one walks the east path before sunrise. Masha looked at her face and did not ask why. She only crossed herself and pulled the door shut hard. When Bohdana came back to the shrine, the boy was standing now, white-faced, watching the window. "Did they take it?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. But when she crossed the room to the shelf, she saw that the loose board had been pressed down once more, just enough to leave a thin line in the dust. And under the stove stone, where she had hidden the heaviest silver, the floor felt cooler than it should have, as if the damp from below had already begun to rise. Bohdana. By morning, Bohdana had stopped asking whether the men would come back that day. She was more interested in where the fin had already started changing under them. The loose board under the shrine shelf had been set back in place, but she did not trust it. She lifted it again with 2 fingers, slow and careful, and the smell that rose out of the gap made her jaw tighten. Cold mud, wet wood, and beneath that, a sour staleness, the smell of water that had sat too long under a floor. Someone had been under there recently, not long enough to leave a handprint, long enough to leave their weight. The boy stood in the doorway, clutching his sleeves in both hands. "Did they come inside?" "Not all the way," Bohdana said. She pulled the silver bundles out and checked them one by one. Still there, still wrapped, but the cord around the largest one had been retied with a knot she did not use. It was a boatman's knot, the kind men on the river learned, because a bad rope in a storm could kill you. That was the part that made her go still. Whoever touched the shrine had watched how the boatmen worked. She slipped the bundles back under the stove stone and dragged a chair over it for no reason except to make the room feel occupied. Then she went outside. The fog sat low over the fin, not thick anymore, just thin enough to let you see the tops of the reeds bending in the wind. The landing path was empty. No boat, no voices. Only the mud prints from yesterday, and beside them a second line of marks where a pole had tested the ground before stepping. Bohdana followed that line to the edge of the bank and stopped. There, half sunk in the black water under the reeds, was the end of a skiff oar. Not the whole boat, just the oar blade, wet and dark, nudged into the mud and forgotten. It had been there long enough for a skin of slime to begin on the wood. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked to the nearest hamlet and knocked on doors with the back of her hand. The first woman she woke had flour on her wrists and a baby asleep on her shoulder. The second had been mending a boot by the stove. Bohdana told them the same thing she had told Masha. Lower boards locked, no one on the east path. Children kept inside until the light came up full. No shouting, no fires by the shore. A single dropped spark in the dry reed beds could turn the whole bank into a screaming wall. People listened when she spoke like that. Not because she frightened them, because she sounded like someone who had already counted the cost. On the way back, she passed the little crossing where the ground narrowed and the water pressed close under both sides of the boardwalk. The air there was colder, and her breath came out thin. She crouched and put her palm to one plank. Damp. The wood had taken on a soft give that had not been there yesterday. A bad sign. The sort of thing old women noticed and men called nerves. She straightened, and that was when she saw the thin line of dark water running across the path ahead of her, no wider than a finger, shining in the gray light. A crack, not in the boards, under them. And from somewhere beneath the crossing, very close, came a slow knocking sound. Once, then twice, as if somebody down below had started to climb. Bohdana eased herself down to one knee beside the crossing and put her ear to the plank again. The knocking was there, softer now, buried under the wet hush of thawing reed roots. Not a hand, not a nail. More like air trapped under old wood, pushing its way out in little tired pulses. When she pried the board up with the tip of her knife, a breath of cold, rotten smell rose from below. The stink of black water and peat that had been sealed too long. She did not flinch. She just held the board higher and looked into the crack. The space under the walk was no longer tight against the mud. It had opened into a thin, dark seam, wide enough for a hand, maybe wider farther in. Tiny bubbles crawled along the water skin below, and every few seconds the whole line of the crossing gave the faintest tremor, as if the fin were rolling its shoulder in sleep. Bohdana pressed her palm to the plank beside the crack and felt the chill of it climb through her skin. "Off the board," she said, not loudly, but with that hard, steady voice that made people listen. "Now." The boy near the shrine came first, running before she had even finished the word. A woman at the far end of the path froze, then grabbed her little girl by the elbow and backed away so fast her clogs splashed in the mud. Bohdana pointed to the east path, then toward the safer rise beyond the willows. "Keep the children in. No one crosses here today, and if you hear water under your feet, you turn back." Nobody argued. That was the thing about a place like this. People could doubt a story. They did not doubt Bohdana when she looked at the ground as if it had just spoken to her. By the time she reached old Masha's door, the first crows had started moving in the gray sky. Their wings flashed wet and black above the reeds. Masha was already tying bundles of dry rushes across the lower latch, her face pinched with fear, but her hands steady. Bohdana told her to keep the stove hot and the door barred until morning. The east path was done for the day, maybe longer. Masha nodded once and did not ask questions. She only looked past Bohdana's shoulder toward the fen and swallowed. When Bohdana returned to the crossing, she brought a long pole with her. It was one of the old reed poles kept for pushing boats off mud, stripped smooth by years of hands. She set the end on the first board and leaned her weight into it. The pole dipped, lower than it should have. She pushed again, and the wood gave a small, ugly sigh. Then the pole sank, not slowly, not like mud. It dropped hard, as if the floor had opened underneath it. Bohdana jerked back just in time, and a pulse of cold black water spat up through the crack, wetting the hem of her skirt. She stared at the line in the boards. It ran straight toward the shrine bank, and from somewhere under the crossing, right below her knee now, came that same careful knocking again. Except, this time, it sounded much closer, as if whatever was down there had reached the underside of the path and found her feet. Bohdana. Bohdana did not go near the crossing again right away. She took the long way back through the reeds, one hand on the pole, the other holding the edge of her skirt clear of the mud. The fin had gone quiet in that uneasy way it gets when something below the surface has shifted, waiting. At the hamlets, she made people listen. A strip of willow brush went across the east path, a red rag on the post by the lower boardwalk. 2 old men helped her drive a stake into the ground where the path had started to give, and when they hit the 3rd blow, the earth answered with a small, hollow thud from underneath. One of them muttered a prayer and stepped back so fast he nearly fell. Bohdana did not smile. "Keep off it," she said. "If it starts talking, you're already too late." That was the only warning she gave. The rest she left in their hands. By midday the fog had thinned, and the damp cold sharpened until it cut through wool. Bohdana went back to the shrine, barred the door, and crouched under the stove stone. The silver bundles were still there. The cords were still tied, but the air around the hidden cache felt wrong now, too cool, as if the stone had begun to sweat from below. She touched the top bundle and froze. Under the cloth, 1 coin had shifted. Just a little. Enough to show that somebody had counted the weight and set it back in a hurry. She looked at the wet cord on the floor again and understood the part that made her stomach tighten. They had not only been here to steal, they had been sounding the place, like men tapping a floor before they crossed it, finding the soft spots, learning where the boards lied. The ring men were not finished with the shrine. They were measuring it. When she stepped outside, a sound drifted over the reeds from somewhere beyond the bank. 1 dull knock, then another. Pole on wood, slow, careful. Close enough to raise the hair on her neck. Bohdana stood still and listened until the sound came again, farther this time, as if the unseen boat had shifted in the fog and was now working its way along the edge of the fin. The rotten spring ice had not fully broken yet, but it had started to breathe. She could hear it now in the far water. Little wet cracks under the skin of the bog, soft as knuckles on a door. Bohdana went to the crossing once more and set her pole against the first board. The wood gave under her weight in a way it had not this morning. A warning. She pressed down harder, and beneath the plank something moved with a slow, slippery drag, then went still. For a long breath she did not move. Then she pulled the pole free and stepped back, because now she knew what was under there, and because, just beyond the reeds, the skiff's oar knocked wood again, this time from the wrong side of the bank. Bohdana, an old Marsh healer who set bones and brewed fever cures for 5 flooded hamlets, is given an ultimatum by a riverboat extortion ring demanding the votive silver the peasants entrusted to her shrine. She warns them the bog keeps what it is owed, and at the spring thaw she lets the rotten ice and sinkholes swallow them, then melts the silver into a new bell for the drowned chapel. Bohdana did not waste time trying to listen for a 3rd knock. She backed away from the crossing, picked up her pole, and went straight into the reeds where the ground rose in a narrow strip of firmer moss. The air there smelled worse than on the path, sour and metallic, like cold tin left too long in water. Every few steps her boots sank and came free with a wet kiss from the mud. She found the weak place by sight before she found it by feel. The boards over the crossing sat a finger's width lower on the left side now, and a hairline crack had opened where the last plank met the bank. Not enough for a man to see from a boat, enough for a woman who had spent half her life reading the fen with her feet. Bohdana crouched, pressed 2 fingers to the seam, and felt a faint tremor pass through the wood. Something was moving below. Not fast, not random, working. She rose, took the long reed pole in both hands, and shoved it down at the edge of the crossing where the board ended and the mud began. The pole went into the knuckle mark without resistance, then farther, too far. She pulled back, and the pole came up coated in black slime and a string of pale roots. Under the reed mat, the bank had washed out into a narrow hollow. One more good thaw, and the crossing would drop a man into water up to his chest, maybe deeper. Whoever had been knocking from below had not made the hole. They had found it. That was the thing that chilled her most, not the ringmen themselves, the fact that somebody on the fen knew enough to use the fen against her. Bohdana turned and walked the long route to the east hamlet, where the houses sat close together like old teeth. She knocked once on each door she passed, gave out no stories, only instructions. Children inside, doors barred after dusk, no one near the lower path, no one near the shrine bank. Old Masha heard the tone in her voice and did not ask why. She just took the yoke from her shoulder and went to fetch the men with shovels. By the time Bohdana reached the second house, a thin, distant bell tone came over the reeds. Not from the shrine, from farther off, low and careful, the kind of sound that does not belong to any village work. She stopped with her hand still lifted from the door and listened again. A second note followed, then a third. It took her a moment to understand that she was not hearing a bell at all. It was a pole tapping wood, carried strangely through the fog, answered by another tap from farther left. The men in the skiff had changed position. They were moving under the reed line, hidden from the crossing, using the flooded side cut that only locals knew about. Bohdana's mouth tightened. She looked back toward the shrine bank and saw, just for a second, a sliver of light between the reeds. A lantern screen, low to the water, moving where there should have been no path. And then she heard it again, a man coughing, close enough that the sound seemed to brush the back of her neck. Bohdana. Bohdana did not answer the cough. She listened to it, counted the space between one sound and the next, and then turned away from the reeds, as if the fen itself had stopped being her concern for a moment. That was how she moved when trouble was close. Not with panic, with work. She went straight back to the nearest hamlet and rapped on the first door with the end of her pole, then the second. People were already watching from behind curtains and cracks in the shutters, pale faces in the gray light. When they saw her, they opened. Nobody in those houses needed a long story now. Bohdana only told them to keep the children inside and stay away from the east bank until she came back. No one asked why. The cough had already done that part. Old Masha crossed herself and followed her out with a shovel in both hands. Two men from the next yard came too, one with a lantern hooded in his coat, and the other carrying a bundle of dry reed mats. Bohdana pointed them to the low crossing where the boards had started to give. "We lift these," she said. "Not all of them, just enough to make the path ugly." One of the men blinked at her, then understood. Ugly paths made greedy men slow down. Greedy men stepped where they should not. Bohdana had spent her whole life watching how people moved when they thought they were alone. They pulled at the loose planks and tilted two of them upward on one side, so the path looked open from the far end, but wrong underfoot. Then they laid the reed mats over the soft strip beside it, not to help anyone cross, only to hide the water that shone under the matting. The old women of the fen knew this trick. Make danger look ordinary. Let the ground lie by itself. By the time they finished, the fog had brightened to a cold, milky gray. The smell of wet straw and mud sat heavy in Bohdana's nose. She stood at the edge of the crossing and watched the reed line beyond it. There, a lantern screen, low, moving, under it. The skiff had not come back to the landing. The men were working the flooded side cut, the narrow bit of water that curled behind the reeds and under the bank, where the old ditches met the open fen. That route could slip a boat in behind the shrine if you knew the turns, and if you did not know them, you would end up nose first in a quaking sinkhole before you ever saw the bank. Bohdana's mouth tightened. She had not told anyone to watch that cut because she had not wanted the fear spreading through the hamlets any faster than it already had. Now she wished she had. She took the long reed pole again and walked back toward the shrine bank, stepping slow, testing each board with the side of her boot. The crossing gave a little under her weight, then settled. On the far side, just beyond the reeds, something scraped wood. A pole end. Then a voice, low and rough, speaking from a place she could not see. Not to the villagers, to her. And when the voice came again, the fog carried one word clear as a knife edge. Bohdana. Bohdana is given an ultimatum by a riverboat extortion ring, demanding the votive silver the peasants entrusted to her shrine. She warns them the bog keeps what it is owed, and at the spring thaw, she lets the rotten ice and sinkholes swallow them, then melts the silver into a new bell for the drowned chapel. Bohdana did not answer the voice at once. She stood with one hand on the pole, listening to the reed line breathe around her, and the whole fen felt tight, like it had drawn in a breath and was waiting to see who would speak first. The fog had thinned enough now to show the pale tops of cattails and the black shine of water under the matting. Somewhere close, a duck lifted off with a slap of wings, then vanished into the gray. The voice came again, rougher this time, carrying over the water from the hidden cut behind the shrine. "You hear me, Bohdana? We know where you are." Not shouted, said like a man testing a blade with his thumb. She still did not turn. That was the trick here. If she turned too quickly, she would show him the bank, the boards, the way back to the shrine. So she kept her eyes on the crossing and let the sound tell her what she needed. One man on the water, one on land, farther right. Maybe more in the reeds, if they were smart. That made her move. She slipped back off the crossing and took the narrow strip of firmer moss beside the reeds, stepping where the ground had the least give. The pole sank a little with each plant of her boot, not enough to matter, enough to tell her where the mud was softest. She followed the line to the side path and saw what they had done. One of the reed mats had been shifted, not far, just enough for a wet rim of water to gleam through. A trap made to look like a shortcut, the kind of thing a man would step on when he was thinking about a roof to burn, and not the path under his feet. She crouched and pressed the tip of her knife into the matting. It slid through with barely any resistance, rotten from below. The rainwater had chewed the support right out of it. So they had not only found the crossing, they had been working their way toward the shrine bank from the backside, testing each patch of ground, looking for a way in that did not make noise. Bohdana's mouth went thin. That was not guesswork. That was a plan. She turned her head just enough to call toward the hamlet without raising her voice. "Masha, bring the men with shovels, now, and keep the boy inside." No answer came, only the wet hush of the reeds, and farther off, the soft clink of something metal against wood. An oarlock, close enough that it should not have been possible. Close enough to put the skin on her arms tight. Bohdana took one step toward the shrine, then stopped. Under the left side of the crossing, below the broken board, water moved with a slow, round push, as if something had shifted its weight from one shoulder to the other. She looked down at the dark seam in the wood and saw a bubble rise, burst, and leave behind a little ring of oil-slick water. The ring men were under the path now, and from the reeds behind her, only a few paces away, a second voice answered the first one in a whisper so low it almost vanished. "She's right there." Bohdana. Bohdana did not waste a breath answering the voice. She set the pole down flat across the path, then stepped over it and moved toward the shrine bank with her shoulders low and her eyes on the waterline. That was the only way to keep the fear from climbing into her hands. Let it live in the ground, not in her grip. The reeds on the left were bending the wrong way, not from wind, from weight. Something had pushed through them and then eased back, careful as a fox. She saw the broken sheen of a wet sleeve once, just once, between two cattails. Then it was gone. The ring men were still there, and now they knew she knew. She stopped where the boardwalk narrowed above the black seam in the mud. The whole place smelled of cold silt and old rope, and under that, faint but sharp, the sour breath of stagnant water. Bohdana listened. One man on the water, one in the reeds, maybe a third farther back. No shouting, no rush. They had learned the way of the fen by watching it breathe. Good, she thought. Let them be clever. Clever men step where the ground invites them. She turned and called for Masha again, louder this time. Bring the shovel men and take the children to the far house. Then, because the hamlets needed the words more than she did, she added, nobody goes near the east path. A door banged somewhere behind her. Another. Old boards, old hands, people moving before fear could settle in. She heard it all and kept her face still. At the crossing, the loose plank she had marked earlier gave a soft dip under her boot. Not much. Enough. The reed mat beside it had been tugged back, and under the fibers the water glinted in a thin line. The hidden cut behind the shrine was working its way forward again. Whoever was under there had either found a way to kneel in the mud or was flat on his belly in water up to the chest. Bohdana did not need to see which. She stepped back, then placed the pole tip on the board and pressed. The wood answered with a low, hollow crack that ran away under the path. That sound made her look up. At the far end of the reeds, near the place where the flooded side cut bent toward the shrine, a lantern screen moved once, barely a finger's width, then stopped. She caught the smell next, almost hidden by the fog, a thin, oily stink of lamp fuel and river tar. The same smell from the cord, the same smell from the oar handle. They were circling her bank now, trying to slip around the crossing while the ground was soft enough to hold their weight for a little while longer. If they reached the backside before the villagers shut down the east path, they would have the shrine from behind. Bohdana's jaw tightened. She knew the shape of that plan now, and she knew something else, too. Under the path, the water had begun to move faster, restless from pressure, as if the dark below had heard them coming and shifted its body to listen. Then a voice rose from the reeds, closer than it should have been, low and rough and full of breath. "She's on the bank." Bohdana froze, not because she was afraid of the words, because the voice had not come from the water side. It had come from behind her. Bohdana. Bohdana did not turn at once. She let the voice hang in the fog and listened for the shape of it, for the breath behind the words, for the little scrape in the reeds that tells you where a man is standing when he thinks he is hidden. Then she moved, not fast. Fast gets you killed in the fen. She slid one step to the left, using the board edge as cover, and drew the pole up beside her like a staff. The mud under the crossing answered with a soft, sucking sound. Somewhere close, a reed stalk snapped, and the smell of river tar drifted stronger than before. One of them was near enough to have been breathing through wet cloth. "Bohdana," the voice called again, lower now, almost amused. "No need to make this hard." She looked toward the hamlet first, not the reeds. That was the point. If she showed them where her eyes went, they would learn who mattered to her. Instead, she lifted her chin toward the house line and said, loud enough for the nearest doors to hear, "Masha, now!" The answer came at once. A door slammed, then another. Bare feet on wood, a shovel handle striking a wall, a woman's voice telling children to stay down. Good, they had heard the warning. The fen would not be empty if the boatmen tried to rush the bank. Bohdana stepped to the crossing and drove the pole tip into the board seam she had marked earlier. The wood dipped. Not much, but enough. A second shove made the left plank give a thin, ugly groan. She looked down at the crack and saw water standing under it, black as pitch. The men in the side cut had been working that weak place from below, just as she feared. They wanted the shrine path to collapse under her feet or under the first villager who ran to help. Not if she could help it. She braced the pole across the path and dragged one of the reed mats up with the butt end, twisting it so the softened patch beside the crossing looked solid from a distance but would bite through under weight. Then she shoved a handful of chopped rush stems into the gap, not to fix it, only to hide the shine of the water below. Make the ground lie longer. That was all she needed. A low laugh came from the reeds behind her, too close, and the boy in the shrine gave a sharp little cry from somewhere inside the room. Bohdana's stomach tightened once, hard, then went still. She heard it then, the smallest sound of all, a wet scrape in the mud under the bank, like a knee moving through grass. The men were under the path. She could feel the whole crossing faintly tremble under her boots, as if the wood had begun to worry itself loose from the land. Somewhere out beyond the fog, a lantern screen shifted, and a thin ribbon of light slipped through the cattails. One of the boatmen was moving around behind the shrine bank, trying to take the backside while she watched the crossing. The fin had become a mouth with 2 rows of teeth. Bohdana tightened her grip on the pole and called to the villagers without looking away from the reeds. "Nobody steps on the boards! Nobody!" Then, from the far side of the bank, just beyond the shrine wall, a man's shoulder appeared between 2 stalks of dead grass, close enough now for her to see the wet shine on his coat and the pale shape of his hand reaching toward the back door. Bohdana. Bohdana heard the whisper behind her and did not turn. She let it hang there, thin as a reed stem, while her eyes stayed on the back wall of the shrine and the strip of ground beside it. The air smelled of wet bark, rope tar, and the sour cold that rises out of a fen just before something gives. The boy inside had gone silent. Good. Silence was safer than panic. "Stay put," she called, not looking back toward the stove. Then, louder for the hamlet, "No one comes near the shrine. Keep the doors barred." A second shape moved in the reeds. Not a full body, only the shine of a sleeve and the dark crown of a shoulder. Bohdana knew then that the man by the back door was only the first hand on a larger body. They were circling her bank from both sides, trying to squeeze the shrine between water and wood. She shifted 1 step to the left and drove the end of her pole into the rear porch board, right where the wood had gone soft from years of damp. It answered with a low groan. The man at the back door must have heard it, because he hesitated. That was enough. He tried the latch. Bohdana snapped the pole sideways, pinning the door just as his hand closed on the frame. The door shuddered. His weight came forward too fast. 1 boot landed on the rear step, and the rotten plank under it cracked clean through with a sound like a dry bone breaking in a hearth fire. The man swore and dropped hard into the black water under the porch, half his leg disappearing into the sink of mud and old reeds. He grabbed for the frame. Bohdana stepped in, not close, just close enough to hook the pole under his wrist and shove the hand away before he could find the latch again. He screamed once, sharp and ugly, and the sound was swallowed by the fin. That scream pulled the second man out of the reeds. He came low and fast, slipping over the matting beside the back wall, 1 hand out for the door, the other already closing around a knife handle. Bohdana saw the wet shine of his coat and the pale smear of his face through the fog. She did not run. She planted the pole across the narrow strip of ground between the porch and the reed line, the same strip she had watched all week, and shoved down with both hands. The soft edge gave way. The man's forward foot slid first, then the whole patch of bank slumped under him with a wet, heavy sigh. He flung out his arms, caught the cattails, and still went down to the thigh in sucking black mud. His knife flashed once in the gray light, then sank out of sight. Behind her, from the hamlet side, she heard running boots and the thump of a shovel handle hitting wood. Masha and the men were coming. Lantern light bobbed through the mist, pale and shaky, and that little sound was enough to make the hidden man in the reeds curse under his breath. Bohdana did not look away from the bank. Under the back step, something moved again. Not the man, not this time. Something lower, something under the shrine boards. A small, deliberate knock from below the wood, as if someone inside the ground had heard the struggle and was answering it. Bohdana. Bohdana did not waste a word on the man reaching for the back door. She swung the pole sideways and caught his wrist before his hand found the latch, then drove the thick end straight into the wet seam of the porch. The board gave with a sick little crack. His boot slid. His knee hit first, then his shoulder, and the pale shape of his face flashed once in the fog before the back step folded under him and dropped him half into black water. He cursed and clawed at the frame. Bohdana leaned her weight into the pole and pinned him there. Not enough to break him, just enough to keep him from getting his feet under him again. The fin swallowed the rest of his shout. It always did. Sounds came into that place and came out smaller. Behind her, from the reeds, the second man lunged low and fast, knife in one hand, shoulder hunched like a fox in the ditch. Bohdana saw the wet shine on his coat, the mud on his knees, the narrow white line of his teeth when he bared them. She did not step back. She planted the pole across the soft strip beside the shrine wall and shoved down hard. The ground gave way. Not all at once. First the matting sank, then the hidden water under it shifted, and the man's forward foot slid sideways, and the whole patch slumped under him with a wet sigh, like breath leaving a sick chest. He threw out one arm and grabbed cattails, but they bent and tore, and he went down to the thigh in sucking black mud. His knife flashed once, then disappeared beneath the surface. "Now!" Bohdana snapped, and that single word cracked through the fog. Marsh's lantern came bobbing through the mist from the hamlet side, followed by two men with shovels and a boy carrying a hooded light in both hands, his face pale with fear and smoke. Their boots hammered the boards. The light found the first man half under the back step, cursing and thrashing. It found the second one in the reeds, one leg trapped, one hand clawing at mud that would not give him back. "Don't go near the bank," Bohdana told them. "Keep to the boards. Rope them if you can reach, but do not step where I tell you not to." The men obeyed. That was the strange mercy of a place like this. A voice that knew the ground could sound more certain than fear. One of the shovel men slid a loop of rope around the first man's ankle and dragged him clear enough to bind his wrists with a length of rush cord. The second man spat mud and tried to crawl, but Marsh's shovel handle came down across his hand with a sharp crack, and he screamed until the fin swallowed that too. Bohdana should have felt relief. She did not. Under the shrine boards, just beneath the place where the silver slept, something answered with a small, deliberate knock. Once, then again. From under the wood itself, as if somebody below the floor had heard the fight and had decided to tap back. On a fog-bound river fin, Bohdana, an old Marsh healer who set bones and brewed fever cures for 5 flooded hamlets, is given an ultimatum by a riverboat extortion ring, demanding the votive silver the peasants entrusted to her shrine. She warns them the bog keeps what it is owed, and at the spring thaw, she lets the rotten ice and sinkholes swallow them, then melts the silver into a new bell for the drowned chapel. Bohdana did not speak to the knocking under the boards. She looked at it, listened to it, and then turned her head toward the hamlet side, where the lanterns were still coming through the fog. Marsh's light bobbed first, then the shoulders of 2 men with shovels, then the boy with the hooded lamp held close to his chest. Their boots slapped the planks fast, too fast for men who understood wet ground. "Stop at the last board," Bohdana said. They did. Good. The first rule of the fin was that the ground liked people who listened. One of the bound men at the back step had gone pale in the face. He was trying to twist free without making noise, and the mud had him past the calf now. The other, trapped deeper in the reed edge, kept staring toward the shrine wall, as if he expected the wood to split and open for him. Bohdana did not waste breath on either. She crouched instead and pressed 2 fingers to the edge of the porch plank. The vibration came back through the wood, faint but real. Something lower, something that had shifted under the shrine. Masha saw her face change and made a small sound in her throat. "Is it the bank?" "Part of it," Bohdana said. "Keep the children away from the east path. Keep them indoors until I say otherwise." The men with shovels looked toward the reeds, then at each other. One of them swallowed hard and raised the lantern a little higher. The light slid over the wet reed tops and caught a patch of mud where a narrow channel had opened since morning. Not wide, just enough for a boot heel to slip through. Bohdana pointed at it. "Fill that," she said, "and put the boards back behind the shrine, not on top. Leave the rotten ones where they are." One man blinked. "Leave them?" "Yes, make the path look safer than it is. A liar board is better than a broken one." They set to work at once, because by then they knew her tone. No room for questions. The pole man knelt with the shovel men and started throwing wet reed mats over the soft edge, packing mud around the seams so the bank would hold for another hour or two. That was enough. She did not need forever. Just long enough to keep the ringmen from getting what they thought they had found. Behind her, the first captive started to cry out, not loud, only a thin, ragged whine when the rope cut into his wrists. Bohdana turned just enough to see that his boot had sunk deeper and the black water under the porch was rising around the broken plank. The fin was taking him slower than a hand could. That was its own kind of lesson. Then, from under the shrine floor, came the knock again. Once. Twice. Not random now, deliberate. Close enough that Bohdana felt it in her ribs. She stood still and listened. The sound was coming from beneath the part of the shrine where the silver had been hidden, not from the porch, not from the mud at the back door. For a second, the whole place seemed to tighten around that little sound. The lantern flame trembled. The boy with the lamp looked up at her, eyes wide. Bohdana lifted one hand, not to calm him, just to hold everybody where they were. And then, from the far side of the shrine bank, beyond the reeds where no one should have been standing, a wet shoulder shifted in the fog, and a voice said her name again, very softly, as if the speaker was right beside her ear. "Bohdana." Bohdana did not answer the voice behind the reeds. She kept her eyes on the back step, on the pale hand reaching for the shrine door, and on the small, ugly dip in the mud where the bank had already begun to breathe. The fog smelled of wet rope and cold silt. Somewhere close, one of the bound men was still dragging air through his teeth, like he did not trust the bog to let him keep it. "Back," she said. And that one word was enough to make the shovel men stop at the last board. Masha came in first, lantern hooded under her coat, her face hard with fear. Two men followed with shovels raised low, not as weapons now, but as props against the soft ground. Bohdana pointed with the end of her pole. "That edge, not the middle. Put the matting there, and don't step where I don't step." They obeyed because the fin had already taught them what a careless foot cost. One man slid the first reed mat across the gap beside the crossing, and the wet wood under it gave a soft, ugly sigh. Bohdana watched the sound more than the movement. A path that sighs is a path that wants men dead. The man half under the back step tried to pull his leg free. He got only as far as the ankle. The mud held him with that patient, greedy strength the bog used when it had decided something belonged to it. Bohdana planted the pole under his wrist, not to break it, just to pin him long enough that he stopped reaching for the latch. His curse burst out once, then died when the black water under the porch lapped his chest. Then she heard it. Not the men, not the shovel handles. A dull, careful scrape under the shrine boards. She froze. The sound came again, lower this time, from beneath the place where the silver slept. A wet drag, a little pause, then another, like someone crawling under the floor with elbows and knees in the mud, taking care not to bang wood. Bohdana looked down at the board seam and saw a thin ribbon of water trembling there, no wider than a finger. Under it, the board flexed once. "Don't go inside," she told Masha. Masha had already turned toward the shrine door, and that stopped her cold. The woman's lantern shook once, sending a pale stripe of light across the threshold. The boy, white-faced, pressed himself against the stove wall with both hands over his mouth. Bohdana crouched beside the seam and slid the pole tip under the loose board she had noticed earlier. The wood lifted with a wet pop. Not far. Enough. Under it was not mud. It was a narrow black hollow, a finger of water running under the shrine foundation toward the stove stone. And on the underside of the board, smeared in damp clay, was the mark of a hand. Small, not one of the men outside. Then from under the stove stone itself came a soft knock, followed by another, as if something below had found the silver cash and was tapping to see whether the metal would answer. Bohdana. Bohdana did not move at the first knock. She stood with the pole in both hands and listened to the second one, and the third, and the tiny wet scrape that followed it under the shrine floor. Not on the boards above, under them, right under her boots. The sound was so close now that she could feel it in her calves. "Back from the stove," she said, very low. The boy took one look at her face and obeyed without a word, pressing himself against the wall with the lantern hooded under his arm. Masha stepped away from the threshold, one hand already on the shovel handle, and the men on the porch stopped fighting the mud long enough to listen. Even the bound ring man under the back step went still for one tight second, as if he had heard it too. The Finn had a way of making liars honest for a breath. Bohdana crouched beside the stove stone and ran her fingers along the seam. Cold. Damp. A thin draft came up from beneath, carrying the smell of wet peat, old iron, and stagnant water that had sat too long in a hole. She pressed harder. The stone gave a hair's breadth, then settled back. There was a hollow under it, enough. "They've dug under the shrine," she said. Masha made a small sound in her throat. One of the men whispered a prayer. Bohdana did not look up. If she looked too long at faces, she would start to think about fear. Better to keep thinking about ground. "Pull the reed mats off the back strip," she told them. "Not all of them, just enough. I want the water to move." No one questioned her. They moved at once, dragging the damp matting aside in rough, quick handfuls. The back edge of the shrine bank showed black and shiny under the thinning layer of reeds, and where the matting came away, a narrow trickle of water began to run through the soft mud. Not much, just enough to wake the hidden cut behind the wall. Bohdana felt the floor answer under her knees. A shiver ran through the old boards. Somewhere below, under the shrine foundation, somebody cursed in a choked whisper. Then another voice answered him from deeper under the wood. The men in the hidden hollow had found out the water was moving. Good, Bohdana thought. Let the bog keep what it is owed. She shifted the pole under the front edge of the stove stone and levered it up a finger's width. A cold breath came out of the gap, sharp enough to sting her nose. Under the stone was not earth. It was a narrow black throat of water and mud, slick with something pale that caught the lantern light for just a second before the shadow swallowed it again. A silver edge, or a wet shard. She could not tell which. Then the floor knocked back, not below the bank this time, beneath the shrine itself. 3 sharp taps, impatient now, and after them, a scrape that sounded like metal dragged over wet wood. Bohdana froze. The hidden men were no longer just listening. They were moving toward the cache, and from the far side of the shrine, beyond the boards and the reeds and the dark water under the porch, a voice rose out of the fog, breathless and tight with panic. "We found it. It's under here." Bohdana. Bohdana kept her eyes on the reeds and let the whisper hang unanswered. The voice had been meant for her. She knew that much at once. Not a threat, not a prayer. A hook. Something to pull her head one way while another hand worked under the boards. So she stood still, one palm on the pole, and told Masha in a voice that would not shake, "Stay off the back step. Keep the boy by the stove. No one goes near the shrine wall." Nobody argued. The men with shovels came closer, lanterns hooded low, their boots making that soft, wet slap the fen always seemed to swallow. Bohdana pointed to the back edge of the shrine bank, where the reed mat had started to look too neat, too smooth, a path made by careful hands. "There," she said. "Lift that mat. Not you, Masha, you." One of the men crouched and pulled. The moment the mat shifted, black water shone under it, and the man hidden at the far side of the bank made a mistake. His shoulder broke the fog, then his knife hand, and Bohdana saw him for what he was. Not a ghost, not a spirit, just a wet, frightened man trying to crawl around the shrine while the ground gave way under him. She jammed the pole into the soft strip beside the bank and shoved. The mud swallowed his front foot, then his knee. He yelped and clawed at cattails, but the cattails only bent, and Masha's lantern found him full in the face. One of the shovel men grabbed his wrist. Another drove the shovel blade into the bank beside him to stop the collapse from widening. The man came free with a filthy, choking sound and went down onto his side in the reeds, knife lost somewhere in the black water. Bohdana did not look at him again. She turned straight for the stove stone. "Now," she said. The men came with her, and together they pried up the heavy board over the hidden hollow. Cold breath rushed out from below, sour with mud and old iron. Under the stone, the silver bundles lay half asleep in a pocket of black water, cloth tied tight and beads of moisture trembling on the weave. Bohdana reached in first. The saint plaque was there. So were the rings, the coins, the small wrapped pieces the villagers had brought in fear and hope. The metal felt icy enough to burn. Then something closed around her wrist, a hand, from under the floor. A desperate one, fingers slick with clay, nails scraping the wood. Bohdana held still long enough for Masha to see. Then Masha brought the shovel handle down hard on the boards beside the hole. The grip loosened. The hand vanished with a wet jerk, and a thin cough came up through the hollow, low and wet and frightened. Bohdana snatched the bundles free, wrapped them in her apron, and backed away from the opening. Her heart was hard in her chest, but her hands stayed steady. She counted the weight once in her arms, then once more in her mind. All but one. She looked up. Across the reeds, beyond the back bank where the fog had thinned to a gray smear, a figure stood, half turned toward the water, shoulders hunched under a wet coat. In one hand, he held the saint plaque, its little bright edge catching what little light the fen had left. He must have pulled it free before the hole closed on him. He looked back once, saw her watching, and did not run. He just lifted the plaque a little higher, as if to remind her where it was going, and started off toward the drowned chapel path. Bohdana, an old Marsh healer who set bones and brewed fever cures for 5 flooded hamlets, is given an ultimatum by a riverboat extortion ring demanding the votive silver the peasants entrusted to her shrine. She warns them. The bog keeps what it is owed, and at the spring thaw she lets the rotten ice and sinkholes swallow them, then melts the silver into a new bell for the drowned chapel. Bohdana did not try to pull the figure back through the fog. She watched the saint plaque glint once in his fist and then vanish down the drowned path, and only then did she move. She crossed to the stove stone, opened the hatch beneath it, and took out the silver one last time. The cloth bundles were cold enough to sting her palms. Not much had been left from the ringmen's hands now, only the little weight of trust the hamlets had given her. Bohdana laid the bundles on the bench, unwrapped them, and checked each piece by touch. Coins, rings, the plaque, all still there, all still hers to answer for. The back bank had gone quiet, too quiet. The men who had been under the floor were no longer shouting, and that was worse. Bohdana listened for the scrape under the boards, the cough, the wet shuffle of bodies in mud, but the fin was holding its breath again. In the far reeds, something heavy slid once through dead grass, then stopped. Maybe the man with the plaque. Maybe not. She looked toward the hamlet and called, "Masha, bring the box." Masha came with the small, iron-lined box they kept for the shrine offerings that needed to stay dry through winter. Bohdana set the silver into it and shut the lid. Not to hide it, to keep the wet from taking its shine before the work was done. The bell came from the distant chapel path again, faint as a spoon on glass. Once, then twice. Not a real bell. Not now. The same careful tapping from before, carried through fog and reed and the black water under the bank. Someone was still out there, moving with the plaque, or trying to make her think they were. Bohdana wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Outside, the lane between the shrine and the hamlet was empty, except for the leaning reeds and the shallow tracks left by the last runners. A skin of frost had begun to form at the edges of the mud where the shade held. The air smelled of wet wood, old ash, and that sour fin smell that always came before a hard cold. She could hear the men with shovels behind her, setting their tools in the bank, and Masha inside the shrine telling the boy not to come out no matter what he heard. Good. Let them stay where she could count them. At the crossing, Bohdana stopped and looked down at the board she had half broken and half saved. Under them, the water had gone still again. Too still. If she had not already seen enough of the fin's tricks, she might have missed the little bulge in the mud just beyond the last plank. A place where the ground had risen and fallen once, like a chest under a blanket. Something under the water. She felt the old warning settle in her bones. The bog had taken the men with the silver path, but the path itself was not finished, not yet. Somewhere beyond the reeds, beyond the drowned chapel trail, somebody had started back toward her, with the plaque in hand, and the sound of their steps came soft as rain on a grave. Bohdana took the silver from Masha's box with both hands and carried it to the little room behind the stove, where the heat was thin but steady, and the walls were blackened by years of smoke. The iron lid of the old cauldron waited there on 3 stones. She set the pieces down one by one, and the metal clicked softly in the silence. Coins, rings, the saint plaque. The hamlets had given these things for safekeeping, and now they were coming back to her one last time. Outside, the fin had gone gray and still. No voices, no boat scrape. Even the reeds seemed to hold themselves upright and listen. The boy stood in the doorway with his hooded lamp, eyes wide, not asking anything. He knew that look on her face now. It was the face she wore when a bone had to be set clean, or a wound had to be cut before the rot spread. "Keep the door shut," she told him. "Nobody comes in until I call." He nodded and pulled the plank across with a soft thud. Bohdana fed dry reed stalks into the stove, then struck the old flint. The first spark died. The second caught, a small yellow bite in the dark. Soon the fire took with a low hiss, and the room filled with the smell of hot ash, wet wool drying too fast, and metal already beginning to warm. She laid the silver in the cauldron. The saint plaque lay on top, its edge bright in the flame. For a moment the little face on it seemed to watch her. She did not look away. The water under the shrine gave a quiet thump, then another, something lower. The old hollow under the boards settling under heat or pressure, or the fin taking its own measure. Bohdana held the poker in one hand and stirred the silver with the other, slow, patient. She had melted iron from stove scrap, boiled roots for fever, pulled splinters from children's feet. Silver was only another thing that had to be changed by fire. The first ring softened at the edge. The coins lost their sharp shine. A thin breath of pale smoke rose when the waxed cords on the offerings burned away. carrying the smell of old prayers and river mud. Bohdana worked the bell mold she had prepared days ago from clay and ash, the shape hidden under a blanket beside the wall. No one had seen it yet, not even Masha. It was squat and rough, the kind of bell it would not sing sweet in a city chapel, but would carry over water and reeds and frost. A knock sounded on the outer shrine door, not a hammering, a tap, careful. Then a man's voice, low and rough from cold, came through the boards. "Bohdana, open up." She kept stirring. The silver inside the cauldron had gone from bright to dull, then to a glowing white seam at the center. The bell mold waited, and the fire crackled under it, and the room smelled now of hot clay and something like rain before lightning. The voice came again, closer this time, and this time there was another sound beneath it, a wet drag across the porch boards, as if someone had come back from the bank and was standing right outside the threshold with something heavy in hand. Bohdana. Bohdana kept the fire low and the room hot enough to make the cauldron sweat. The silver had gone from a heap of cold weight to a dull, glowing sheet under the flame, and she worked it with the poker in slow circles, never hurrying, never looking toward the door. That was the hardest part at the end, not the danger, but the waiting. The fin could be loud when it wanted. Tonight, it was holding itself in. Outside, the last of the ringmen, still standing somewhere in the reeds, had gone quiet. No boots on the porch, no voice through the boards, just the wet drag of something moving away. And now even that was fading under the reed hush. Bohdana set the clay mold beside the stove stone and tipped the molten silver into it. It flashed once, white and fierce, then sank with a hiss. A thin sting of metal smoke rose into the rafters. The boy at the doorway stared with his mouth open. Masha made the sign against bad luck, but she did it without taking her eyes off Bohdana. The healer waited until the mold stopped breathing steam, then brushed ash from her hands. "Go on," she said. "Put the shutter against the wind." Masha crossed the room and closed the outer boards. The little latch clicked. The sound was tiny, but it landed deep in the silence. Bohdana did not touch the mold again until the metal had begun to set. Then she turned it with both hands and saw the shape she had meant to make. Not a church bell from the town, pretty and thin and made for songs. This one was squat and hard, broad at the lip, built to carry over water and wind and winter reeds. A bell for a place that had to be heard through fog. The thought warmed her more than the stove did. Something thumped outside, far off, down the drowned path. Not close enough to matter yet. A step on wet plank, maybe, or a body slipping where it should not. Bohdana listened, then reached for the small iron chain she had saved from an old harness hook. She threaded it through the eye at the top of the bell mold and tested the weight. Good, heavy enough to sing deep. Masha came closer, face lined with smoke and worry. Will it hold? Bohdana looked at the set silver, at the smooth skin of it cooling in the clay, and nodded once. It'll hold. That was the thing the hamlets needed most to hear from her. Not that the night was over, not that trouble had gone, only that the thing meant to answer the dark had not cracked. The stove popped softly. Somewhere beyond the shrine wall, under the porch boards, or in the wet reed cut, a second sound answered it. Not a knock now, not a voice, but the scraping slide of something being dragged slowly back from the bank. The last of the men were leaving, or being taken, and Bohdana could not tell which. She only knew the fog had begun to thin by degrees, enough for the first pale trace of dawn to press against the window glass. By morning, the new bell would hang in the half-sunken chapel over still water, and when the wind crossed the fen, it would carry farther than shouting ever could. Maybe farther than fear.